Serene, your book is so visceral and poetic and sweeping. And by the time you reveal this information in your book, your reader is so invested in this place where you grew up and your experience there. And you say two things that strike me so much when you tell the story of seeing that postcard of the lynching for the first time. You say there were two parts of you, one that wanted to curl up into a ball and just disappear and will it away, and then one part of you that just wanted to confess right then and there that this was your family's land, and that your grandfather would have been 6 years old and probably in attendance at the lynching and among the picnickers, and the people out reveling in the sunshine while watching this horrific act go down. And that struck me so much because that just reveals how I think so many white people feel when they learn things about our country's history or their own family's history. And it's this moment of contention. Which one are you going to do? And in the book, you also say, along with inheriting my grandpa's love of fishing, I also inherited I also had to face my inheritance of Laura Nelson's brutal murder. And you paint a really vivid picture of how you took the time to sit and imagine in great detail what happened to Laura that day, how she felt, how she was brutalized and probably raped before she was hung, and how her family she must have been in excruciating pain, and her family, you could imagine her family wailing in grief. And that type of courage and honesty to actually have yourself sit and imagine what this person went through is sort of what 99.9% of white Christians are missing. It's something they can't seem to get themselves to do. And most people make the choice to curl up into a ball and will it away. And I think the typical reaction, of white people who might find out something like this is to say, well, I wasn't there. It wasn't me. It wasn't my fault. I didn't do it. That was, what is it? What is it, do you think, that allowed you to use a very Christian term, stand in the gap,
Yeah.
to take on the responsibility of not just accountability and acknowledgement, but even atonement, in a sense, for what had happened throughout your family's history on the land you grew up in?
Well, two things I want to say. The first is that it's also very powerful to me in trying to understand the legacy of white supremacy in the United States and the traumatic process by which white people are constructed into cruel monsters that are capable of inflicting this kind of violence on bodies. And I try to imagine what my 6-year-old grandfather would have thought. Like, by 6 years old, are you so convinced of your white supremacy that you're actually able to believe that this is a party? Or when you're 6-year-old boy, is your reaction to it that you run down to the river and throw up? And you want to run and hide. And the process of becoming a man is learning to take pleasure in watching the pain of others. And that's part of wrestling with the legacy of white supremacy, is how do people who are born human become white and become capable of the cruelty that this nation is built upon, which was a cruelty and a story of identity that was absolutely necessary for chattel slavery to exist. and we still live in those identities that allowed for chattel slavery to exist. Um, for me, taking responsibility for my ancestors' actions is directly related to my faith. There's so many scriptural accounts how the sins of the mothers and the fathers are visited upon the children, and how we do not let them go. They don't disappear, but they're passed down from generation to generation. I'm also, as a theologian, very aware of this notion of original sin, that, you know, these harms, these systemic structures, these cultural ways of acting are something that are given to us the minute we're born. It's the language that we inherit from our parents and our grandparents and their parents. And so having that deep sense of connection to my own history that made me who I was, I can take the good stuff, but I also have to take the sin
Mm.
that construction, that legacy, and bear it as my own. Because if I don't, and if we don't, how does it ever get shifted and how does it ever get changed? If we don't recognize it as something that is ours, that is still living within us and all around us, if that recognition doesn't happen, then how do we even begin to address it? Um, so it was my faith, and it was actually, the love and the complexity of my family that gave me the courage to do that.
Mm. And, it's so interesting because with white Christianity in particular, um, there's a Jesus in the story who goes so far as to be crucified on the cross, spit upon, beaten, tortured, as part of identifying with the downtrodden and the oppressed. And instead, white Christianity has curled up in a ball and made it go away, that's who Jesus was, that they're supposed to be following, by instead saying, no, Jesus, if I just say this prayer, I'll be saved from all this. And so it's such an interesting juxtaposition of using Jesus as almost an escape hatch, um, instead of following that example of doing, in many ways, what you illustrate in the book, which is that deep, hard grappling of putting yourself in the shoes of other people and really trying to embody and enact what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. And I have to wonder how much theology and dogma and all the different ways that it can be interpreted, it renders Christianity sort of helpless for most people. You're very different in how you interpreted it and acted upon it.
Yeah, I at the very end of the book, the one of the last sections is my grappling with the fact that my grandparents, my grandfather, who I'm talking about, was the same age as James Cones's father, and he narrates the history of his mother and father in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in which he talks about their journey in Arkansas and what it meant to grow up under the strictures and the terror of Jim Crow. And I just imagine the cross as the modern day lynching tree, that Jesus was lynched. And what does it mean that this Black life in Arkansas, just a mere 50 miles from where Laura Nelson was lynched, is a parallel track to my grandfather's life as a white privileged person in Oklahoma, who was more often than not putting people on crosses. And juxtaposition of those two stories is the story of the United States, and is the story of of the very different experience of growing up with the, the entitled innocence that whiteness allows,
Mm.
and painful knowledge and terror that blackness insists upon.